James Lehr Kennedy grew up in Needham, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston. He attended the College of Worcester as an undergrad and earned a master's in economics in 1973 and an MBA in 1975, both from Ohio State. He began his professional career as staff economist to the newly formed Ohio Siting Board. The Siting Board licensed energy facilities, natural gas pipelines, electric transmission lines, and generating stations. Since 1900, U.S. electricity consumption had grown at 7% per year, accompanied by an equivalent dropping in the price of electricity. The 1973 energy crisis caused the price of electricity to rise. It was the belief of the electric utility industry that electricity was a necessity, and people would pay any price for it. As an economist, Mr. Kennedy realized that perfectly inelastic demand was a rarity, and in fact, as the price rose, electric consumption was dropping rather than rising. In 1978, Mr. Kennedy testified in Power Siting Board hearings on the Erie nuclear power plant. Using econometric modeling, he demonstrated that construction of the plant was not justified. So effective was his testimony that not only was the Erie plant canceled, but $8 billion of other plants in Ohio and Pennsylvania were canceled or indefinitely postponed. In the late 70s, Ohio experienced a shortage of natural gas, which resulted in schools and business closings. The utilities and legislature asked Mr. Kennedy to design a process whereby adequate supplies of electricity and gas would be assured, but that overcapacity would be avoided. House Bill 378, which Mr. Kennedy drafted with the utility industry, created such a process. Mr. Kennedy administered the process until his departure from state government. Mr. Kennedy found himself to be an energy expert and testified in hearings before the U.S. Senate subcommittees and was a consultant to Oak Ridge National Laboratories in the design of energy information systems. During this time, Mr. Kennedy was also a lecturer at Ohio State, teaching macroeconomics. Over 12 years, he taught over 6,000 students. In 1990, Kennedy invented a system which would enable utilities to handle the massive call volumes which occurred during power outages. In 1993, he left state government to devote his attention full-time to his company, 21st Century Communications. Mr. Kennedy adapted his technology to be used for emergency notifications. It was used to evacuate San Diego in the path of the 2007 wildfires and reunite families separated by Katrina. When he sold his company 20 years later, it was in use by 70% of the utilities in the United States, and 21st Century had operations in Canada and the United Kingdom. Mr. Kennedy is the author of the James Swift Steampunk book series, currently available on Kindle and soon to be in hard copy. He holds more than a dozen patents and copyrights. In retirement, he devotes his time to family, friends, and philanthropy, and to a variety of small businesses in which he is part owner. In 2016, he received an honorary doctorate from Ohio Northern University.
Hi, I'm James Kennedy, and I want to share with you a different view than you might have heard about the Wizard of Oz, specifically as an allegory on monetary policy. An allegory is a story with a hidden meaning. The Wizard of Oz was written by Frank Baum 120 years ago and was one of the most popular books of its time. And while The Wizard was originally meant to be a one-off, the demand was such that he did 13 more Oz books. Since that time, there have been over 100 spin-offs of Oz, and the Internet Movie Database lists 45 Oz-related movies. It's never been out of print, and it's become part of American culture. Baum himself made a 1902 musical of The Wizard of Oz. In '77, there was The Wiz, which had Michael Jackson in it, a relatively forgettable movie. And then Wicked, which was a book and then became a play musical, and now is being filmed as a movie. So Wizard of Oz is very much part of American culture. Here are some images that I brought down off the internet, show some of the diversity of Wizard of Oz. The one that's kind of fascinating to me is the one in the upper left where it says she's off to off the wizard. The thing that we all remember, though, is the 1938 musical with Judy Garland. That's the one that influences us most as we think about the story. You know the story, you know the characters, you think this is a children's story, but I'm going to let you see the Wizard of Oz story in a new way, and you will not be able to think of the Wizard of Oz the same after you've heard my presentation, I hope. Just as an aside, the story's link to monetary policy was not made until 1964, 64 years after its publication, by a high school teacher, Henry Littlefield. Other economists have come up with more detailed analysis. To the informed viewer, abundant clues are in plain sight. I can't give them all as part of this presentation, but as you go through it, I think you'll see that my thesis has some validity to it. First, I want to talk about the United States as it was in the 1880s. We were recovering from the Civil War. The South was decimated. 2.5% of the population was killed during the Civil War. That's, in today's valuation, that would be the equivalent of 7 million people dead. 40% of the population are farmers, and that compares to less than 2% today. And 60% live in rural areas as compared to 25% today. There were decades-long deflation and multiple bank panics. And the big issue of the day in the late 1800s was bimetallism. The way the money supply worked in the 1800s was that you brought gold and silver to the U.S. Treasury. They gave you gold and silver coins or paper equal to the value of the metal. And that's how the money supply was increased. A growing economy needs a growing money supply, as we're all familiar with the quantity theory of exchange. A shortage of money creates a higher price of money, that's to say interest rates. And in 1873, the Treasury stopped taking silver to make coins, effectively halving the money supply. This concentration on the gold standard and not accepting silver created particular problems for the farmer. Now, the farmer should be doing well. There's the rotary steel plow that gives great efficiency. There's the McCormick reaper, which replaces the scythe, and there's early mechanization. However, during an inflationary time, prices go up and the value of your dollar drops, but a decade-long deflation causes the value of the dollar to increase. And if you're a farmer, you borrow money at the beginning of the season for seed and fertilizer, and you don't get your payment until the end of the season, so you're paid back in lesser value dollars. There were a number of railroad monopolies that gouged the farmers, high interest rates, and there's even documentation that says that some bankers wanted to bankrupt the farmers and go to the European model where you had tenant farmers as opposed to the American model where farmers owned their own land. So the gold standard, that is to say, not having two currencies, not having gold and silver, worked against the farmers and small business, and it hit their rural communities the hardest. And how bad was it? Well, let's look at the price deflator. You can see that the very significant deflation is occurring. And then if you look at farm prices, you'll see that farm prices are dropping. So you have a double whammy for the farmer: deflation and a decrease in the value of his produce. All of this started a populist movement. It was called a storm out of Kansas because that's where the original movement began. The movement focused on free silver, that is to say, a restoration of silver currency into the money supply in a 16-to-1 ratio. 16 silver equal 1 gold. And another aspect of this was to break up monopolies, particularly the railroads and government ownership of utilities. And a very popular book at the time was Coyne's Financial School, which makes the case for both gold and silver currency, which is called bimetallism. And it sold 1 million copies, and it was the first economics primer for public consumption. Coyne's Financial School consists of a series of lectures given by Coyne, who is either a 12-year-old boy or a very small man. Basically, he builds an economic argument for restoring silver into the money supply. And this book made a profound impression in the United States. And I don't know if you can read the descriptions of the book at the top, but one of them is that it scourges the money changers in the temple of the Republic, which is how people talked back in 1900. This is a slide from the book, and what you see is labor being burdened by debt, stabbed in the back with the crime of 73, shackled by interest rates, on the road to pauperism, and his house is mortgaged. On the left, you'll see a woman depicted as prosperity being throttled by a ruffian banker, while silver is chained to a post and can't rescue her. And then on the right, you see Uncle Sam being rescued from destruction by bimetallism. This last slide I'd like to talk a little bit about. Apparently, labor was depicted at the time by wearing a square cap. And you see a laborer, and he's on his lunch break from the factory, and his healthy, rosy-cheeked daughter is coming up. She's bringing him his lunch in a lunch pail. You can see the lunch pail. And the factory is working, and you can see that from the smoke coming out of the factory. And the date is 1872. And then with monometallism, the factory is closed due to shortage of funds, and his daughter is impoverished, and he's impoverished, and the factory is closed. All right, going back to the 1938 movie and the book, the movie is actually 2/3 of the Wizard of Oz book. The book itself is substantially longer, and the movie misses a mission to the Good Witch of the South, Glinda. And for the sake of the movie, they combined the two witches into one. And to take advantage of Technicolor, Dorothy's shoes are ruby, but in the book they're silver. Now, the big defect of the movie, because they combined the two witches into one, at the beginning of the movie, the Good Witch of the North tells Dorothy to take the silver shoes. Then at the end of the movie, it tells her that these shoes that she's worn all the time, all she needs to do is click them together and she can go home. And why she didn't tell her that at the beginning of the movie and make Dorothy go through all the travails that she did, maybe the Good Witch of the north wasn't all that good. This is the land of Oz, and it's derived from the full series of 13 books written by Baum. And the Munchkins all wear blue. The Winkies, where the Bad Witch of the West is, wear yellow. And the Good Witch of the South's kingdom, of where the Quadlings are, all wear red. And there actually is some thought on this, the East being blue collar, the South being redneck, and the West being desert and gold, and the Emerald City being green. Good witches to the north and south, wicked witches to the east and west. Dorothy represents the American people at their best. She's honest, kind-hearted, plucky, and she is from Gray, Kansas. And while in the book she's just known as Dorothy, in subsequent books her last name is given as Gale, all of which ties into the Free Silver movement, which, as I mentioned earlier, was called a storm out of Kansas. And Dorothy, in fact, rides a tornado to Oz. Toto. One of the groups that supported the Free Silver movement were the Prohibitionists, who were called teetotalers. And Baum makes it pretty clear the group that Toto represents, because there's a line in the book where it was said, or he said, Toto followed soberly behind. And again, the Prohibition movement was a big movement around the turn of the century. Populism was thought of as the storm out of Kansas. It is the Free Silver movement. The Wicked Witch is killed when Dorothy's house lands on the witch. The witch represents Eastern money interests, and when she's killed, the Munchkins are set free. The Munchkins are the little people, so Dorothy has helped the little people. She takes the silver shoes. Dorothy is told that the shoes have a powerful charm, but the Munchkins don't know what it is. And the quest begins. She has to take the perilous yellow brick road to Oz. Why a yellow brick road? Why not a dusty path through a woods? Why not a paved highway? The yellow brick road is the gold standard. And in the book, as opposed to the movie, the yellow brick road is not completely paved, and there are big gaps in the road, so it's not the flat plain that the movie depicts. Which brings us to the Scarecrow. The Scarecrow believes he's not smart. People tell him he's not smart. He wants a brain. Yet in the book and the movie, he's the smart one. He's the one who comes up with the solutions. Dorothy frees him from a post, and she has to, in the book, repeatedly help him through holes in the yellow brick road, which he falls into. The Scarecrow is the exploited Midwest farmer, hurt by the gold standard. The Tin Man. The Tin Man's story is that he loved a Munchkin girl, and she was living with an elderly woman and caring for her, and the witch is paid to stop the marriage. In fact, we know from the book that she was paid 2 sheep and a cow, and she enchanted the Tin Man, who was a woodsman, to cut off parts of himself. He became ever more efficient, and Dorothy frees him by oiling his joints. He thinks he needs a heart, yet throughout the book, he's the kind and caring one, and in fact, he frequently cries and needs to be oiled to keep his movement. He is the dehumanized factory worker, dehumanized by capitalism. The Cowardly Lion is Williams Jennings Bryan, and he was actually called the Cowardly Lion because he was a great orator, but yet he was against the war with Spain. And he is the classic proponent. He's the flag bearer of the free silver movement, and we'll talk about him later. So, on the way to Oz, they come to a gorge, and the lion carries each member of the party across the gorge on his back. Then they come to a larger gap in the yellow brick road, and the Tin Man chops down a tree on the advice of the Scarecrow, and they cross the gorge by walking on the tree. But then they are attacked by calidads, which are a combination bear-tiger with long claws, and they represent the journalists. In the book, the Scarecrow falls into a stream, and a swan comes and rescues him. The swan represents the suffrage movement, which also supported free silver. And finally, they get trapped in a poppy field, and it is country field mice that rescue Dorothy and the lion. And Baum was very much against U.S. involvement in China, and the poppy field represents the Opium War in China. Okay, the Emerald City. Everybody who comes to the Emerald City has to wear green glasses held in place with a golden band. In other words, they have to see the world through the color of money. And in fact, Dorothy, to get to the wizard, has to go through 7 passages and up 3 flights of stairs. That is a reference back to the crime of 73 when silver was removed from the currency. And in fact, the wizard says, in this country, everyone must pay for everything he gets. The wizard lets them in when he sees Dorothy's silver shoes. And in the movie, the wizard appears in one form, a giant head. But in the book, he appears differently to each character. To Dorothy, he's a giant head. To the Scarecrow, he's a beautiful winged lady. To the Tin Man, he's a 5-limbed, 5-eyed beast. And to the lion, he's a ball of fire. The wizard is a politician. He's different things to different people. And the Emerald City is Washington, D.C. And they are assigned a new quest, having come all the way from the land of the Munchkins. They are sent out to kill the Wicked Witch of the West. And the witch sees them coming and sends them a plague of 40 wolves, which are killed by the Tin Man, then a hive of bees, which sting the Tin Man and die, a plague of 40 birds that are sent, that the Scarecrow dispatches, and then finally an army of Winkies, the citizens of the West, and the lion scares them off with a roar, and then flying monkeys that then kidnap the members of the party. The witch wants the silver shoe. She knows their power. And again, Dorothy accidentally kills the witch. Dorothy is obviously a dangerous person to be around if you're a witch, having killed 2 wicked witches. She frees the Winkies, and they return to the Wizard of Oz, having killed the Wicked Witch of the West. And the wizard gives the characters what they've already been shown to have. The Scarecrow a brain of pins to show that he's sharp, and a degree to show that he's educated. The Tin Man gets a little heart of red velvet. The lion drinks a courage potion from a green and gold bowl. And he attempts to take Dorothy back to Kansas in his balloon. And in both the movie and the book, he's unable to do so, and he leaves without them. And the Good Witch of the North says, well, you need to see Glinda, the Good Witch of the South, and that is the new quest. And in their adventure to the south, they come to a great wall, and when they cross over the wall, they discover that there are very little people, only 12 inches high, made of china, and just about any action they take breaks them. So they leave as quickly as possible, and that represents bombs. As I mentioned earlier, he did not want the U.S. to be involved in the activities in China. They come up with people who are hammerheads, whose heads butt them off the hill so they can't get to where they're going. That represents the intellectuals. And they come to a forest, and the trees won't let them pass. And when they get into the forest, there are no lions, and that's because a giant spider has killed them all. So the lion cuts off the spider's head, representing the railroad monopolies, and using the gold cap to fly them over different obstacles, they reach Glinda. Glinda shows Dorothy how to use the silver shoes, which she's had on all the time. And this is a picture that actually shows them on the Southern Quest, and you can see the wizard's balloon in the background, and then on the left you'll see one of the flying monkeys, and then the living trees, and behind them the broken homes of the China people. Okay, back to the real world. The tight money policy, the deflation, has made things worse. As I mentioned, there are a number of bank panics. Unemployment is depression levels, and we're coming up on the 1896 election. And that brings us to our cowardly lion, William Jennings Bryan. The Chicago Coliseum, the Democratic Convention, and Bryan is going to give the most brilliant political speech ever given. And this is something that historians and political scientists and economists and communications scholars and PR scholars research, and even today. And William Jennings Bryan is 36 years old, and he will have been the youngest person to ever run for president. And the convention is divided between those who support the gold standard and those who want free silver. And Bryan is the representative to the convention from Nebraska, and he has made a deal where he will be the last speaker of the convention. And the previous speaker is Governor Russell of Massachusetts, who is a pro-golder, but he's actually too sick for anyone to hear him. And in fact, he dies a week after the convention. Bryan's speech is called the Cross of Gold speech, and while it was not recorded at the convention because that did not exist at the time, that technology, but he later recorded the speech for posterity, and you will actually be able to hear the Cross of Gold speech given in Jennings' own words.
I would be presumptuous indeed to present myself against the distinguished gentleman to whom you have listened, if this were a mere measuring of abilities. But this is not a contest between persons. The humblest citizen in all the land, when clad in the arm of a righteous cause, is stronger than all the hosts of error. I come to speak to you in defense of a cause as holy as the cause of liberty, the cause of humanity.
Bryan then goes on to talk about the bimetallism and its importance, and more or less dismantle the case for the gold standard. And then he makes this statement.
When you, turning to the gold delegates, come before us and tell us that we're about to disturb your business interests, we reply that you have disturbed our business interests by your course. We say to you that you have made the definition of a businessman too limited in its application. The man who is employed for wages is as much a businessman as his employer. The attorney in a country town is as much a businessman as the corporation counsel in a great metropolis. The merchant at the crossroads store is as much a businessman as the merchant of New York. The farmer who goes forth in the morning and toils all day, who begins in the spring and toils all summer, and who by the application of brain and muscles and the natural resources of the country creates wealth, is as much a businessman as the man who goes upon the board of trade and bets upon the price of grain. The miner who goes down 1,000 feet into the earth or climbs 2,000 feet upon the cliffs and brings forth from their hiding places the precious metals to be poured into the channels of trade are as much businessmen as the few financial magnates who in a back room corner the money of the world.
Now, what he has cleverly done is he's drawn a contrast between the common man and the Eastern city-dwelling elite. And he compares the farmer with the businessman who he casts as a gambler. And basically, at this point, he has his audience in the palm of his hand. And they're just going wild. There are two ideas of government. There are those who believe that if you only legislate to make the well-to-do prosperous, their prosperity will leak through to those below. Historians note this is the first time the concept of trickle-down economics is mentioned in political speech. The notion of raising up the poor and the common man would inform political discussions for the Democratic Party for the next 80 to 90 years. Reformer Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, and Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. Likewise, the incarnation of trickle-down concept we see informing today's Republican Party with tax cuts for the job creators, a euphemism, of course, for the wealthy.
They tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We reply that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city of the country.
And having done that, he comes to his big finish.
Having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the commercial interests, the laboring interests, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.
As he was saying these words, he placed his hands on his head, fingers extended like a crown of thorns, then spreads his arms as though he were being crucified on a cross. He holds this pose for 5 or 6 seconds. Now the hall, which had been cheering his every statement, has become dead quiet. He's thinking to himself, was that last bit a little over the top? He returns to his seats. The audience is still, stunned. And suddenly the Colosseum goes wild. People are throwing their hats and coats in the air. They're waving their handkerchiefs. And they rush the stage. They carry Brian on their shoulders. The state banners are all placed with Nebraska. And he wins the Democratic nomination, which is awarded to him the next day. So the book ends with the Scarecrow replacing the Wizard of Oz as king. The Tin Man becomes king of the Winkies, the Western Kingdom. The lion rules the southern forecast, Dorothy goes home to Kansas, and the silver shoes are lost in the great desert. And that is the end of the book. However, public opinion forced Baum to write 13 more Oz books. And then his relatives started writing Oz books, and others have written more Oz books. And I think the total number of direct descendant Oz books is something like 26. And then, of course, there have been scores of spin-off books which don't necessarily follow the catechism of Baum's Oz books, and then dozens of movies. So what happened to Williams Jennings Bryan? He loses his bid for presidency 3 times, and the gold standard is kept in place. Bryan goes on to serve as Secretary of State under Wilson, and we hear about Bryan again with the Scopes monkey trial when he is a very old man. So while the gold standard is kept in place, gold has been discovered in the Yukon. Gold was discovered in South Africa. The cyanide process makes gold extraction cheaper and more efficient, and it's now possible to extract gold from poorer ore. And crop failures in Europe help the farmers in the U.S. and bring gold back into the country. Therefore, the money supply increases, deflation stops. And then in World War I causes the world to leave the gold standard. Under the gold standard, anyone could exchange paper money for gold. $20 of paper got you a $20 gold piece. The Great Depression caused massive deflation as people were afraid to spend. There were runs on banks, and people hoarded gold. Once again, the gold standard was shrinking the money supply and hurting the economy and economic recovery. President Roosevelt and Congress in 1933 finessed a way around the gold standard by first ending the exchange of paper for gold, then making it illegal to hold gold, and finally changing the value of an ounce of gold from $20.67 to $35, devaluing the currency by 40%. This effectively increased the money supply and helped stop the deflation. And what we had for years was known as the silver certificate, and in fact, you could take $500 or $600 and go to a federal bank and receive an ingot of silver for your dollars. In 1973, Nixon ended that process, making all U.S. currency fiat money. That is to say, it's money because we say that it's money, and it has worth because we say that it has worth. So, to recap, Dorothy is everyman, Toto represents the prohibitionist, the Wicked Witch of the East is Eastern financial interest, the Scarecrow is exploited Midwest farmers, the Tin Man is dehumanized factory worker, the Cowardly Lion is William Jennings Bryan, and the Emerald City is Washington, D.C. Now, if you think that all I've told you about the Wizard of Oz and monetary policy is just a series of coincidences, something I made up, or just BS, I have one question for you. How do we measure gold and silver? By the ounce. And what is the abbreviation for ounce? Any questions?